cram 3 hours of material into 1 hour this morning. We're now doing it in 45 minutes, so fasten your seatbelts. Here we go. My name is Michele Phoenix, and it's not going to work. This is why we have it up here, so I can do this. I'm an MK from France. My parents were missionaries in musical missions, musical ministry for 43 years. There they are. That's me in the pigtails. I was born in Strasbourg, and then they moved to the European Bible Institute near Paris, which is where I grew up in a castle. To get a little bit of what is it? I'm an MK, we don't do idioms. House cleaning, housekeeping, what do we say about that? Housekeeping? Out of the way. I just want to make you aware of this. Some of you who follow me online might know that I've got some books that have been published out there. Thomas Nelson just picked up a book about MKs, about a missionary family on the field, and the effect it has on the children and the family. I have cards. There's a little tiny round table at the back, and there are actually little save the dates cards with this cover on it, and it comes out in December 2016. So if you want to pick up one of those cards back there, I also have pamphlets. If your organization could use somebody like me, I'd be happy to serve alongside what your organizations do. So feel free to pick up a pamphlet. So MKs are a very unique group of people. If you've known any MKs, you know that to be true. How many of you are MKs? Oh, my favorite audience. Okay. And if you look at the Mind the Gaps book on Amazon, one of the descriptions of the book is to reduce, or purposes, is to reduce the attrition rate of missionaries. And I went back and looked at all the research that's been done about why missionaries leave the field prematurely, as has already been mentioned, and this is for you nonlinear thinkers. In no particular order, children are usually in the top 5, so I combined what the top 5 usually are. And so if we're truly going to be helping missionaries to stay their full length of time overseas in ministry, we need to be addressing the needs of their children. Some of them are preventable. Some of the reasons that they need to leave because of their children are preventable, and some of them take them by surprise. So if we can give missionaries the tools to recognize and prevent some of what it is that damages, to use a strong word, their children, we need to start doing that. And this is really the purpose of this ministry that I do, to open the conversation on topics that we don't usually address, because if you look back at MKs, missionaries' kids who come from decades ago, many of them still carry around with them the burdens of what was not addressed when they were children. So it's hoping to set a better foundation for those who are growing up today cross-culturally. My point is fourfold this morning, or my purpose. One is to paint a broad strokes portrait of what MKs are like. I'm going to be using generalizations. Please understand that. To explore what shapes them. Why are they the way they are? For us to have a common vocabulary going forward for conversations around the tables for the next 24 hours, and then to open that conversation. So common vocabulary so that we can have that conversation. If I were to ask you to describe what you think MKs are like, there would be a lot of very kind of lofty terms used for them, and then the one term that comes back fairly frequently is weird or strange, because it's very hard for us to understand why it is that they are the way they are. Elise, were you able to find those handouts? Where is Elise? You have them? Oh, perfect. And we're not going to do all of that, but we'll start. Even for missionaries who, like my parents, who spent 40 years overseas, it's hard for them to understand what has shaped their MKs because of this difference, and this is how I think MTI explains it. An adult who goes overseas to another culture, say they come from planet Red Bead, and I do this with little kids when I'm in MK schools. I give it to the toughest boy in the class, this jar of red beads, and then we pour blue beads on top of it, and I say, okay, shake as hard as you can. And he shakes as hard as he can, and when he's finished shaking, you can still see the red beads and the blue beads in there. When MKs grow up cross-culturally, it's like blue Play-Doh and red Play-Doh. And I tell the same tough kid, okay, mush these all together as hard as you can. And when he's finished mushing them together, what does he get? He gets this purple ball of stuff with the occasional little glimpse of individual cultures, but it is all messed up in their mind, messed up in a positive sense. It's all combined into who they are. And that's why it's difficult for adults who have even done cross-culture as adults. It's hard for them to fully understand how it impacts MKs. When I'm in these classrooms, I also give them an outline of a face and say, if you were to walk into a classroom with this in front of your face, what would you want on it for people to understand who you are? And do you see the purple Play-Doh in this one? This is a young lady whose parents were missionaries. They actually were Dutch, so you can see the windmill in the middle and the Dutch flags. They moved to Indonesia. You can see Indonesia in there. And then they moved to Nepal. And you can see a little bit of Nepal as well. So this is that purple Play-Doh that I'm going to try to unravel for you a little bit this morning. They have all kinds of strengths, and I want to start with the strengths because we're going to look at some of the tough stuff too. The strengths that you see here, I'll read some of them for you. They're catalysts, communicators, global nomads, tolerant, insightful, mature, adaptable, bold, curious, inclusive, mature, I said that twice, observant, and adventurous. Have you seen that in the MKs you know? Yeah. And I think the best way for MKs, for me to describe MKs, is to let a bunch of them describe themselves to you. So I'm going to play a very short video for you, and then we'll get to work. Here they are. Let's see if the volume's up.
I'm an MK. I'm an MK. I'm an MK. I'm an MK. I went to grade school in Indonesia, middle school in Africa, and high school in Europe. I love the sound of rain on a tin roof.
I've eaten snake, dog, and larvae.
And larvae doesn't taste so good. I know what a meal cooked over smoldering manure tastes like. I got away in Africa. I got to ride in the rain in Africa.
When I watched The Amazing Race, I could say, been there, done that.
We carpooled to school in a canoe. I had coconuts fall on my head. I can rock the transit system. I've literally watched the sunrise over the Serengeti.
Manny's on tries. Really try it. It's really good.
I spoke 4 languages by the time I was in 5th grade. I've driven in 8 countries in 1 day. A baby a day keeps the doctor away. I love airports. I stink at idioms. A bird in the hammer? I don't know. A princess dress is better than a bird in your hand. Laws are really just a suggestion. Airports are my happy place. It made me love and respect every country. I got great stories to tell my kids. Newness doesn't scare me. I have more compassion for foreigners who come here. I have bred and family all over the world. It has broadened my perspective. I've learned that difference is something to be celebrated.
My world is broader, my roots go deeper.
And I wouldn't give it up for a moment. I wouldn't give up for a moment. I wouldn't give it up for a moment. For a moment. Would you? Would you? Would you? Would you? Would you?
Nope. Heck no.
No.
This is actually the premiere of that video. I'm still working on some sound issues, but you're the first to see it. So every so often we're going to put a couple of these up just so these are some of the quotes actually that you just saw in the video from MKs who love growing up as MKs. And this is something we need to be aware of. Even though they might have had some really hard stuff happen to them in the course of growing up overseas, I have yet to meet an MK, even MKs who have gone through trauma, who say, I wish I hadn't been raised cross-cultural. They have this capacity to have a foot on planet happy and planet sad at the same time, or planet challenged at the same time. And that is actually one of their strengths. So what we're doing this morning is based on this article. I'm going to flash these up here every so often. You see my website. It's also at the end of your handout. And if you go in the very middle there to search by topic and look for this title, that's where you're going to find more information on what we're doing. The first C is contradictory. If you know MKs, you know that there's this weird disconnect sometimes between what they're capable of and what they're incapable of. So just looking at a few of these, again, real quickly, they have a global mindset. They see everything through a global lens. So me, the MK, I'm heading off to Germany, England, and France next week, on Tuesday, actually. I know it's a hard life. And because I see things through a global mindset, I'm going to have to try to explain to my French and German friends what's happening with American politics these days. So it's that thing. When we see the local news, we also consider how will the other countries perceive what's going on in this country. Confused loyalties. If you've watched the Olympics or World Cup soccer with an MK and two of his or her countries are fighting each other, it can get to be a physical ache sometimes. A 3D understanding of the world. When they open National Geographics, they can smell it and taste it and hear it. The flip side of that, so these are the flip sides, the good and the challenging. A painful awareness of reality for some of them. Some of them have seen illness, they have seen death, they have been evacuated in the middle of the night for political unrest. So when they see these pictures in National Geographic and remember the sights and the sounds and the tastes, they also remember the emotions that went along with some of what they experienced. Confidence in their international knowledge. They know what they know, and they are looking for a captive audience to just kind of spew it at. And as you can imagine, and I've experienced this myself in my younger years, it can be interpreted as arrogance. Why do you keep talking about everything you know? 2 reasons. Number 1, because they know it, and there's so much they don't know. And the second, because it reminds them of who they are. It takes them back to their foundational pieces. They're adaptable. And we really don't have time to go into this today, but the one culture that they're least adaptable to is their passport culture a lot of times. It's coming back to this country for all kinds of reasons, and if you'd like to know what they are, come find me later. A lack of full belonging to any culture. Belonging is a loaded word for the MK population. We're going to look at that at the end this morning. Strong observational skills. When they walk into a new place, they have this really high value on not doing something culturally wrong or incorrect. So they will stand at the back of the room or stand on the outskirts of a crowd and figure out why people are doing what they're doing and how they're doing it. And then when they feel confident enough, they'll step in. To North Americans who don't understand that, it looks like hesitation. It looks like not wanting to step in and participate. They're actually being MKs. They're standing back and watching for a while until they know. It may look like indecision. If an MK is dating or marries a non-MK, this is one of the first issues that comes up in their dating relationship. Will you just walk in and find a pew? Nope, I'm going to wait back here until I figure out how these things work. Many of them are able to interact on an adult level, not if you've seen this to be true. There are a lot of reasons for that as well. And sometimes, this is certainly the case for me, it's harder on their own level. Now, we've gotten a little bit better at the pop culture because of the internet. They can kind of shoot the breeze a little bit better than they could in my generation, but they're still more comfortable speaking of more substantial things. They're highly savvy in some areas, and the flip side of that is they're completely useless in some obvious areas. So they can do these wonderful things cross-culturally. They can, ride an elephant in Chiang Mai and feel like this is just a normal thing to do, but they walk into a Chipotle and don't know how to order. They can have philosophical conversations in 4 different languages, but they struggle with things like how many cents are in a dime, and I still don't understand American currency. They don't know how to drive at age 20. They have no clue what a running back is. They consider laws as merely suggestions, as the young lady said in the video, or they might try on clothes standing in the middle of a store because they don't realize you're actually supposed to use the changing rooms that are back there. So these are not, it's not that they're weird, it's not that they're different, it's that they're actually acting the way they should in the cultures they come from, and they do not identify with this culture. And it's not a conscious thing. I am not going to do things the way you tell me to. It's just they're acting out of the identity that they've acquired over the years. The second C that we're going to look at is culturally complex. What MKs do, usually subconsciously, is they absorb the values and belief systems of their adoptive cultures without even realizing they're doing that, and they assume them to be universal. So they need people like the American church, like their sending agencies, like the friends and relationships they make here, to help them to sort out what is cultural and what is actually universal truth. So they're juggling 3 different identities. You don't have this in your notes. Their passport culture, which is usually, in this case, America. their adoptive culture, which is any of the countries in which they have lived for a significant amount of time. And then I add the missionary culture to that because it in itself is very much a distinct culture that kind of factors in. So let's look at the adoptive culture first. Can you pick out the missionary kid? I grew up in France, and it wasn't until years later that I started to kind of itemize what it was that I had absorbed from that culture, which I assumed to be true and universal. For instance, adults in authority are supposed to inflict harm and cause fear. This is what I learned from the French culture. My French school teachers would pull my ear until it bled. They would call me stupid, tell me I would never amount to anything, put a dunce cap on my head, literally a dunce cap with the donkey ears, and stand me at the front of the class. I still break out in hives at the thought of math to this day. And they thought that this was good motivation. It was the French mindset, is that you motivate through fear and pain. So I moved from the French school system in 9th grade to a missionary school in Germany, which is where I taught for 20 years after that. And I waited for that whole first year for the teachers to turn on me because I thought, universally speaking, adults of influence were supposed to use cruelty, really, and abuse to motivate me. Other things that I absorbed from the French system is modesty standards. My pastor's wife wore things to church that would have her kicked off most American college campuses today. But there are different modesty standards, which I assumed were universal and didn't realize until later that they weren't. Moral things. When one of our presidents died, President Mitterrand. I'm learning how to say things with an English accent. President Mitterrand. They did his funeral on state TV in the Notre Dame Cathedral, and in the front row on the one side was his wife and child, and in the front row on the other side was his mistress and illegitimate child, and it was absolutely fine because he was a man of influence who had a lot of money. And again, I thought this was a universal truth. So can you see how when MKs cross your doorstep that you might need to be kind of a guiding force in their lives to help them to figure these things out? Their differences, oh, this is me in the French school system. Don't I look happy? Yeah. Does it remind you of a work of art? Let me... So their differences can come in a whole bunch of different categories. Let me go through some of them for you. It can be behavioral, which we looked at previously. They might point with their lips, as is done in some cultures. They might not make eye contact. They might hold hands with a person of the same sex walking down the street. They might leave food on their plate. It's not an insult. It's actually honoring you. Behavioral. Their differences can be philosophical. What is truly valuable in life? What constitutes a meaningful life? If you come from the jungles of somewhere exotic, you're going to have a different answer to that than in North America, aren't you? The difference can be moral. Are there absolutes? What is modesty? Values, alcohol consumption. Not because they're being rebellious, but because that's the way they've absorbed life to be, what right and wrong is. Theological. I love to look at a common verse that we in our culture interpret one way, and then you go to another culture and there's one word in that verse that they pull out of it that we never even noticed, and they build a whole theology around that one word that isn't important to us. So theologically, they might have differences as well. Verbal. Idioms, we struggle with idioms. But also how to use words that express emotion. They might not know the words that are supposed to be used here, or relationship. Relational differences. I think the last breakout session today, I'm doing a whole session on relational differences and grief and how grief affects that in MKs. If you want to understand MKs, it's pivotal to understand how they do relationships. Social differences. What is acceptable behavior in one setting and what is not? They might not get that. Their approach to authority is hugely different from one culture to another. When I speak with MK educators, I've got to tell them that an MK from Spain is going to stand up and get in your face in the classroom because he is honoring you with what you're supposed to do in Spain. It's not that he's being rebellious. So that relationship to authority, to the law, is also a huge thing. We have to tell MKs, don't pull out your wallet and try to bribe the police officer. And emotional. What are you allowed to show from one culture to another? That's very different. In some cultures, grief looks like this huge thing, and in other cultures, grief is supposed to be kind of tamped down. So these are the kinds of emotions or differences you're going to see. I'm going to skip my next little video. and go on to the missionary culture. Can you tell this is old school missions right there? For a lot of MKs, and I wish this weren't the case, and I'm working on, in my small way, making a difference, for a lot of MKs, the missionary culture is the culture of shoulds. They get the shoulds from every corner of the globe. They get it from their parents, they get it from the missionary community, they get it from the sending churches, they get it from the mission organizations. You are an MK, therefore you should be exceptional in every aspect of life. Imagine growing up with this lack of belonging, kind of culturally ambivalent, and on top of that, you're supposed to exceed the average expectations that we put on young people. Here are some aspects of the missionary culture that are specific to us. And that bottom one, the urgent need to live up to the expectations of others, that is where I think a lot of the damage comes from as MKs are growing up in this specific context. So Rebecca expressed this beautifully. Here's Rebecca. She said, "I think the hardest thing I have ever had to do in my life was return to the States. I left behind a place and people who understood me." Nope, wrong Rebecca. Sorry, we're going to get to that one next. I guess that's the crux of being a TCK, is what this Rebecca said. "We're completely alone, and so often subconsciously we make a decision we choose not to trust. Better to keep to yourself. The strong missionary's child is what they want, and that's what they're going to get. It's all that's been drilled into our minds. Be strong, be exceptional, don't give in, overcome." That's a lot of should, and they're feeling it when they're 5 years old and on up. So we need to be really careful in how we articulate things, even in the way we praise them. "Oh, you're so mature for your age." Okay, so I shouldn't be immature ever because this is my calling card. This is who I am. For more on that pressure to be perfect, you can search under search by topics for MKs and hypocrisy. And then they come back to their passport culture, which, as I said earlier, is the one culture that they tend not to really want to adapt to. There are 5 reasons for that, and there they are. I'll fill them in later for you. Back to Rebecca. The hardest thing I ever had to do in my life was return to the States. I left behind a place and people who understood me. I left my culture behind. I left my heart behind. I still feel out of place here even after 11 years. She married an American. She's now had 3 children, and she still feels out of place in her passport culture. A lot of that is because there was no assistance for her to come in and help her to understand and weave her way into this culture. So you who are in member care for your churches, you're actually seeing your MKs at the most traumatic time of their life if you're seeing them when, number 1, they've left their universe behind. Number 3, suggestions, and there's so much more than these. Help them to identify the cultures influencing what you're seeing in them. Ask them, "Oh, is this the way you do that in Spain?" Before going, "Oh, that is so wrong. You got to stop that." Because they might be doing exactly what's right, and it's just not right here. Gently point out what is truth, capital T, biblical truth, moral foundation, and what is just cultural. And here's the problem. Sometimes we find it easy to just say, "You know what, just stop being Spanish. You're in the States now." But part of that being Spanish is what gives them all of those strengths, right, that we looked at. It's being multicultural. So if we can help them to selectively decide, maybe stop. In French schools, cheating is totally okay. Teachers know you're a cheater. They honor the best cheater in the class because it's a higher skill set. So you can tell your MK when you're in the States, you will be kicked out of school for cheating, and truth with a capital T, the Bible says don't cheat. So you can still be Spanish, but maybe on this one you want to be a little bit different. So those are just 3 starts. Here's another one of these. The seminar this afternoon is going to really go into this a little bit more deeply. The number of goodbyes MKs have to say is extraordinary. The effect it has on them is foundational to who they are, and they don't even realize it. So we need to start addressing the concept of grief on the mission field. It's huge. Remember those masks that I showed you earlier? Here's how one Korean MK described the grief that she's known in her life. Bear in mind that the Korean culture is not known to really express grief, and this is how strong her symbolism was. And then on top of that, you add all of the other stuff that adds to the hard part of being an MK, the unbelonging, trauma, abuse, loss, evacuation, illness, separation, poverty, anxiety, alienation, grief, neglect, expectations, transitions, goodbyes, and the pressure to be perfect. Can you see why we need to start addressing this stuff? This is where the bitterness comes from. And if your parents work for an oil company and your family moves overseas and life gets hard and different and you struggle with stuff, you're going to be mad at the oil company. If your parents work for God and the same thing happens, the natural response is to get mad at God, because if he hadn't called, if he had stepped in, if he had prevented, and that's where the dangerous side of this is. There's a whole kind of TCK awakening going on, a lot more talk going on about third culture kids, which includes business kids, military kids, all of those. But I focus on the MKs because of the spiritual component. There are eternal ramifications to not dealing with some of these conflicted issues. So our goal, this is not in your notes, my goal is to help MKs. I use the word stuff because it's a word that they can relate to without feeling overwhelmed by it. To recognize the avoidable stuff, to unravel the confusing stuff, to admit to the tough stuff, to find help for the damaging stuff, and to celebrate the great stuff. So I always try to really come back to those strengths when I'm dealing with MKs and MKs' parents, who sometimes feel like, I have ruined my child. No, you have given your child this great opportunity, and we just need to cut the ties that anchor them to the bad stuff so they can thrive in everything that is good. Again, this will only happen through relationship. I love this Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. She did the grief, the 5 stages of grief. A grief must be witnessed in order to be healed. And we are the ones who can witness it if we can open that conversation. Here's the article on that. We will not have time right now, but this afternoon we will, to go into their condensed relationships. If an MK freaks you out because he's talking about his deepest, darkest secrets in the first conversation you have, that's normal. That's condensed. It comes from loss, and we'll look at that a little bit later. If you can't make that session, here's the article on that. Do you have any questions or comments or illustrations at this point? I realize you're trying to sip from a fire hose at this point, but is there anything that you'd like to add, questions to ask, context, anything? Yes? Some aspects of it will be the pressure to be perfect, yes. There's a book, actually it's PK's, there's a book about pastors' kids. It's called I Have to Be Perfect, I think. Somebody correct me. Thank you. Stanford, yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. 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 Right. Yes. It's the cross-cultural piece. You wouldn't think if they're in stateside ministry would be there, but if they're in stateside ministry in the inner city or in, I don't know what you call it in English, it's First Nation in Canada, Native American. Okay, thank you. See, this is the MK in me. I don't know what words to use. And then you have MKs coming back who have grown up in Canada, and they're trying to talk about African Americans, which we now call black, I think. And I mean, it's really confusing for them, so they'd rather not address or not use any words than try to engage in conversations in these things that just don't make sense. I think I have one more 1-minute video that I want to show you right now, because we talk about MKs being hidden immigrants in the sense that they look the part. To some degree, they talk the part, but on the inside, they're not from here. And we have a patron saint of, I hope this is the right video, it might not be. If it isn't, we'll just move on. The patron saint of hidden immigrants is this man right here, and MKs tend to really gravitate towards him.
Wow! What's this?
This is the North Pole.
No, it's not.
Yes, it is.
No, it's not.
Yes, it is.
No, it isn't.
Yes, it is.
No, it isn't.
Yes, it is.
No, it's not. Where's the snow?
Why are you smiling like that?
I just like to smile. Smiling's my favorite.
Make work your favorite. That's your favorite, okay?
Okay.
Work is your new favorite.
Fine.
It's time for the announcement.
Okay.
Okay, people, tomorrow morning, 10 a.m., Santa's coming to town.
Santa!
Can you see the MK? No, this isn't the North Pole. I've been to the North Pole. You don't know what you're talking about. I can show you snow. Catalysts. So we're moving on to that 5th C. Probably 4 years ago, I was at Moody speaking in one of their chapels, and I had a book table set up, and this man, it was a missions conference, and this man walked off of the street. He saw missions conference signs and wandered by my table, and he was probably a 50, 60-year-old MK who had grown up in South America and moved back to the States and really anchored deep. So we say that MKs either have overdeveloped wings or overdeveloped roots. A majority of them go for the overdeveloped wings. I need to keep flitting from place to place. I'm one of the roots people. I like to put down roots and stay there. So this man was a root guy, and he had established his own company. He had a wife, he had children, he had the picket fence, probably the golden retriever too. And just as he was turning to walk away, I said, so how does being an MK, how do you still relate to that? How does it still turn up in your life? And this man who has everything, his eyes filled with tears, and he said, I still don't feel like I belong anywhere. So this concept of belonging or unbelonging is something huge. And if we can help MKs from a young age to process through what we're going to look at right now, I think it would be helpful for them even into their adult years. This used to be my favorite book when I was little, number one, because I'm a little melodramatic and melancholic, and number two, because I related to this bird who goes to the tractor and the dog and whatever else, the broken down car, and says, are you my mother? Do I belong with you? Are you my people, my tribe, as we say now in MK circles? And this is what a lot of them spend their lives doing. They'll find somebody, they'll invest in that person, and then maybe a month down the road, maybe 10 years down the road, they realize, but that piece of me that's so important to me, you can't relate to that. And so they'll move on to the next person and try to find their mother, their belonging again. So unbelonging, there are three really common responses to this that I've seen in the majority of MKs that I've worked with. The first is to conform. So these are the MKs who will come back to this country, back into your churches, and they'll decide, I will do whatever it takes to become one of these people. So they will make sure they dress right. Again, they're going to stand back and observe until they're sure, and then they're going to try and implement everything they see going on around them. There are some dangers to that. The one is if they get in with the wrong crowd, they're going to also associate entirely with those behaviors and language and whatever. The other sad thing is that they need to completely amputate that part of them that is different in order to 100% conform. And I see that it's easier. I see that this 100% not confusing side of conforming is good for them. But again, their strengths come from the multiplicity of cultures that they represent. So here is, can you pick out the MK who's trying very hard to conform? He's in there somewhere. The second is unconforming. So this is the MK who says, they think I'm weird on that side of the ocean and they think I'm weird on this side of the ocean. Well, let me show you what weird looks like. Have you known MKs like this? They're the MKs who wear, their foreign dress on a college campus in the U.S. Or I've known an MK who put on an accent. He had only been in Croatia for 3 years, so there's no way he had an accent. But to this day, he speaks with a Croatian accent because they just want people to know that I am different. I am not one of you. The other advantage of this in their thinking is that they become the architect of the difference instead of being the victim of the difference. And there's something that feels empowering about that. This is the unconforming version of the MK. And this is what I preach, is straddling. Now, granted, this is not the most comfortable of approaches to cultures. If you get used to it, you can kind of rest in it eventually. You can kind of get comfy with it. The point here is to celebrate mostly belonging. We need to value mostly belonging in a lot of places because it's because of that that they have this broad range of experiences and languages and adaptability, all of that to draw on in life and to actually make a difference because they're straddling, because they're mostly belonging. It looks like this. So I have MKs do pie charts as well. How much of you is American? How much of you is Nigerian? And that's always interesting, and it could change from one day to the next. But say that you're living mostly in blue, like this pie chart is. The advantage of straddling is that if ever you move to red or you meet somebody from red, you can expand that because you're still connected to that culture in some way. And then you might move to green, and you can expand that and be mostly green because you still have a connection and an identification with that culture. This is where we can maximize the strengths of being multicultural. I think you have this in your notes. The goal is to mostly belong. So it's kind of flipping that mindset because it's a very human yearning to fully belong somewhere. I mean, it's just kind of in our DNA, isn't it? But if we can work with MKs and fully express to them the greatness of straddling, the greatness of having multiple places that feel like home, then they can become what we call catalysts or edge dwellers. If you know the theory, what's it called? The cluster theory. Any of you familiar with that? So this is the biggest advantage that I talk about with MKs because it can be applied in a neighborhood, it can be applied in a small group, it can be applied in a global business. This is the way that society usually breaks up. Even think in terms of a city and the blocks in the city. People who are alike gravitate towards each other. In a business, the IT people would gravitate towards each other, the administration. Do you see how that works? Even in a church, we're going to naturally gravitate to people who are like us. And right in the center of each of those clusters is the person who most exemplifies who that cluster is, the person who is 100% embedded. That's who it is. Then you add the TCKs. And the TCKs have a little bit of understanding of all of the different people groups. They have an ability to bridge the gaps. They have mind the gaps. They have an ability to understand different perspectives and different ways of doing things because they're not locked in, like the person in the center of each cluster, they're not locked into just that. It's a broader perspective. And because they kind of gravitate towards the edges, they eventually become the bridge builders. They become the people who can start to help others to see things differently. And again, on a global scale or on a neighborhood scale, this is what they bring to society. So they are the people who expand viewpoints, encourage risk-taking, prove the efficacy of different methods. They instigate change, they introduce innovation, they build bridges between clusters, and they diversify these subcultures that they enter. They can't do that if they have become entirely red, entirely yellow, or entirely blue. That's the beauty of straddling. So when we're trying to encourage them to really embrace the confusing side of who they are, if we can help them to do these 4 things, number 1, to value edge dwelling, to see the benefits of belonging to so many places at the same time, mostly belonging to so many places at the same time. And then to gradually reveal their cross-cultural background. We're going to look at this in the relationship thing this afternoon, but this is really key because they want to kind of storm into college and tell you everything you need to know about everything they've experienced, all the languages they speak, all the people they've known, all the trauma they've, been through. If we can teach them to slowly reveal more of themselves, to first connect on an American level to the MK, the cliche level is your deepest, darkest secrets. They need to learn what cliche is. And then gradually, over time, without freaking anybody out, reveal who you are. To resist censure, this is hugely important. They come back to the States ready to dislike everything and everyone. I did the same thing. I didn't have a chip on my shoulder. I had the Rock of Gibraltar on my shoulder when I came back to Wheaton to study. And it took me all of these years. I'm 48 now and back in the States, and I'm finally grasping the wonderful of this culture that I rejected just on principle for much of my life. So resist censure is huge. And then to be patient. They need to understand that a culture is designed to make those who belong in it comfortable, not to make the returning hidden immigrants comfortable. So if they can figure out, again, stand back, observe, figure out how this works, and honor this culture in the same way that they would honor an exotic culture overseas and use their cross-cultural skills, that is going to make their adaptation here a little bit easier. 2 articles on what we've just looked at. And if you look, survey, what does it say? Survey of adult MKs. Yeah, over there towards the right. I did a survey last year. 2,000 MKs participated in total. They didn't answer all the questions. Huge survey. The full results are 250 pages, which I would be happy to send to you by email. But this tab actually takes you through just a summary of what was said and the trends that we saw in adult MKs. This might be helpful for those of you who are working with them as well. And then this is the goal. This is a quote from a TCK, which is so beautiful. I am a TCK, MK, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. I'm a globetrotter with more adventures in my memory trove than anyone not blessed with a worldwide stomping ground. Whatever it is, I've seen it, tasted it, climbed it, explored it, and survived it. I've managed to grow straight and strong despite my tangled, far-flung roots. I've celebrated my uniqueness and learned to accept its limitations. I found God, too, at every unexpected turn into more challenging unknown. I'm sometimes bruised, sometimes confused, but always grateful for a life so enriched and blessed by living between cultures. I am a TCK. That's the goal. We spend so much time rightly focusing on the parents because they also go through so much cross-cultural stress and transitional stress and grief and trauma and all of that happens on the mission field. But again, if we're truly going to keep them happy and keep their longevity on the field, we need to start addressing what their children are going through too. So when you see the perfect MKs walk across your stages on deputation home assignment, please remember that underneath all that, there's this wonderfully, beautifully complex human being that is looking for a safe place to be able to start to unravel who they are and to fully live in the strengths that they've been given by growing up MK. If you have any further questions, again, my contact information is at the end of your handout. And don't forget this, December 2016. I believe, and not because it's a great book or whatever, but because it tells a story, I think that member care people everywhere should have to read this story because it shows what happens when member care is not involved, when there isn't accountability, when there isn't support, and what the dangers of that are. So thank you very much. You did it.